So I will present wargaming race dynamics. So that is wargaming as a verb. We're gonna wargame the race dynamics in an AGI launch scenario. The goal that we're addressing is we've identified, many people have discoursed on the real risks from the present competitive dynamics, the race dynamics that exist between, for instance, frontier model developers, also to a lesser extent between nations. And we think that these risks need to be studied better so that we can deflect them. And so wargaming is a technique that we want to utilize to explore, to decision support agents in this space. And so conventional wargame mechanisms is a mechanism of integrating the assessments of many experts to create a visceral understanding of future scenarios. And so we're going to build on that methodology in a couple ways. But the idea is to ultimately give those experts the practice that they need with the sorts of decisions that they're faced with to essentially shape and modify their future behaviors. We don't want to do this once. We want to practice this out many times and see how future possibilities emerge. So what's new in our approach to wargaming this space, apart from perhaps just really trying to advocate for this? I mean, I was excited to hear that there's some wargaming efforts already in place at some frontier model developers, but I suspect that not as much as there could be. So apart from just socializing this technique, we want to improve the technique in a couple ways. One is the use of LLMs as players and potentially adjudicators in wargames. This is not new, but we, and there's some research on this already, but we aspire to use them in ways that I think are potentially novel. So firstly, to speed the iterative cycle of developing these war games. Often this is an effort that takes a lot of time and resources to invest, and the time between playtests can be quite long. Using generative AI to playtest these models potentially accelerates that greatly. Additionally, we're interested in the creation of customized adversaries in these games. That can potentially play for certain points of view that you may not have the expertise in-house to take on, and the ability to provide a tremendous amount of cultural documentation that would allow the inhabiting of a role of an LLM in that adversary role could be productive and realistic. Lastly, and maybe in some ways most excitingly, this enables in the future large N analysis of wargame results. One of the shortcomings of traditional wargames is that you can spend 6 months or a year putting something together, run it once over the course of a week, and then you have a result. Cool. If you have LLMs potentially driving it, you could say, hey, here was the 1 or 2 human results we got with experts in the loop, but then here's the 1,000 times we ran it with LLMs, and we can talk about a statistical set of future outcomes that we can study. We also conceptualize, and Dean can maybe help me out with this one if we move forward, the use of smart contracts or cryptographic techniques to construct a war game that would involve inputs from multiple rivals. A common problem in the space is that these war games are held confidentially, and so it's difficult to integrate the points of view from different actors in the space because they don't want to share their strategies. In this use, in this implementation, we would take the moves from 2 or more players, secretly submit them to a secure system for adjudication that only outputs broad statements such as "we all lose" as a result. And so that could spur actors to decide, oh, we thought we were being safe by playing this relatively common default strategy, but in fact, this expert system that's been put together says we get a bad result. So what would the next step be? So what does success look like? As I've implied, changing the decision-making of clients and agents clients who have high agency over the future is really the goal that we're trying to accomplish. In the conventional use, this is by getting wargaming to be practiced by frontier model developers or regulators. We also anticipate the possibility of exposing these techniques to the general public to motivate public attention, and that perhaps then goes into support for governance. There are various risks here. Decision support can be powerful. We wouldn't necessarily want, if we open source some of these techniques, to be available to improve the decision-making abilities of malicious actors. So that is defined as actors here who are opposed to, for instance, opposed to stable multipolar outcomes. So that might be a reason to not go that route or to keep certain parts secret. I'm going to skip a bit on the interest of time and just articulate that. So milestones here obviously involve, getting to initial playtest, which is pretty fast, ultimately up to a large-scale multiplayer game that involves many experts. I've touched on the use of the opportunity for media exposure. Yeah, we're good. This costs $300,000 in 6 months, plus or minus an order of magnitude. Don't know. Portia would probably be a good person to get feedback on that one too. So I'll take questions.
Thank you. With a 41-year-old movie called War Games literally in mind, what would you do to prevent the LLMs trained on this to recognize when they're out of a simulation and potentially in a real-world setting, and not to deploy the strategies against?
Yeah, so the goal of this is really to support human decision makers. I mean, I agree with the intuition that we probably are not ready to give up our agency to LLMs and to sort of take humans out of the decision-making loop. So the use of LLMs here is really as practice, right? And this analogous to the use of in like flight simulators, where you have sort of a constructed physics to allow a pilot to practice landing an aircraft. This is about having a constructed set of decision makers to practice, to like human decision makers to practice that skill.
The
So
War Games metaphor
need to
might
let
be
them out of the
strained,
box.
but it was
Yeah.
like the model didn't realize it was playing in the real world when it was playing these games out. So I don't know if there's like safety mechanisms to somehow put in there, but
Yeah, yeah, and so that's the paper I actually have this link on is exploring in some ways, you know, what are if you let LLMs make these choices, what sort of choices do they make, and what are the tendencies there? And I think that's interesting work. But this work is not about taking the LLM experts and then deploying their judgments in the real world. It's just about letting humans make better choices and changing the strategies we would employ. Another example is changing the setup of the scenario to explore different futures, right? For instance, like if we took group one's proposal and we built a scenario around that, we would be able to game out what the actual actors in the space would want to do, right? So it's about anticipating those futures.
Anyone else? Comments, questions?
Are there any structural weaknesses that LLMs currently have that lead to like semi-predictable like biases in these sort of results that you might get from this?
My experience recently, I'll draw on here. I built a AI politician bot for one of the Apart hackathons that Esben Kron leads, and that was fun and gave me some exposure to what kind of context you could provide, what like deep documented worldview you could provide to an LLM to have it then inhabit a role. And I was heartened to see that seemed pretty effective to me. So while there can be while I think much can be made of the biases in reasoning that exist at within the LLM itself, the ability for users, in our case developers, to curate their decision-making sets by exposing it by sort of overexposing it to a particular worldview seems quite reasonable. And so basically, in short, these LLMs are quite good at role-playing, and we would leverage that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks a ton.